And privilege to welcome you to this session. I am Swati. I've joined as the Director for Domestic Policy with Aspen. Well, today is my first day. And it's with great excitement I tell you that we've just concluded a 3-day Indo-US strategic dialogue. That was our 18th such track 2 dialogue. And today we have gathered here for a discussion on the report Opportunities Unbound, Sustaining the Transformation in India-US Relations by Mr. Ashley Tellis. Ambassador K.S. Bajpai will be chairing this session. Mr. Bajpai was the Secretary of India's Ministry of External Affairs and the Ambassador to Pakistan, China, and the US. He served as the chairman of the National Security Advisory Board from 2008 to 2010. He's also founding chairman of the Delhi Policy Group, an independent think tank, and is involved in several track 2 dialogues. So Ambassador Bajpai will be introducing Mr. Tellis. Over to you, Mr. Bajpai. Thank you.
Can I do it from here, or do you want to?
Wherever you're comfortable.
Does this work?
Yes, it does.
With your permission, I'll remain seated. I've had a bad attack of dengue and I feel rather feeble, so you'll forgive me if I'm not at my best to try it. But you don't need to worry because Ashley is always at his best. Ashley Tellis, I don't think needs any introduction to this audience. He is one of the most remarkable analysts of international relations and strategic issues that I have ever come across. And we are very privileged indeed to have him take a special interest, almost an exclusive interest in South Asia and in India in particular. He has been so highly regarded by his own government and fellow colleagues that he has been sought after by think tanks in America, and he was also sought after by previous ambassador here to come and join him, to guide him into understanding this country. Since Ashley understands it better than I can, I leave him to dwell on it, but I can't help noticing that this charming lady who just started our proceedings said that she had joined as an intern on domestic politics. And yet we are here to deal with Indo-American relations, but frankly speaking, it's very appropriate because it is domestic politics that are the biggest single obstacle to Indo-American relations, I might say in both countries. But on a personal note, I can't help recalling, some of you may find this difficult to believe, but it's exactly 71 years ago this week that I first went to Washington to start school in that city. And I have seen this relationship. People talk about ups and downs. I thought I would say meandering all over the place for many, many decades. And it's thanks to people like Ashley, of course to some changed circumstances, and above all to great leadership on both sides, that we now have not only the beginnings of a very close and productive relationship, but the promise of what is often called one of the seminal relationships of the 21st century. Frankly, I didn't realize that I thought I was going to introduce and conduct the operations of this conference. I didn't realize I was to have a conversation with. There is nothing more boring than a conversation between two people who are in absolute agreement with each other. What can they say to each other except, yes, yes, yes. So I don't know how I'm going to overcome that handicap, but I thought we might start by asking Ashley to give us an outline of his thoughts. And let me, by the way, before I say anything else, this remarkable essay is what I would call it. Actually, the text is less than 35 pages, covers just about the waterfront. About 4 years ago, I was rather worried about the state of Indo-American relations. I thought they were running out of steam. And I had a long chat one evening with Bob Blackwell, and the result of it was, with his usual dynamism, he had 5 great Americans, and I managed to get 5 Indians, equally great in our respect, to produce a similar study for the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. What it took 10 of us in probably 150 pages, Ashley has done all by himself and in just these few pages. So Ashley, the floor is yours. And then when you feel you've done as much justice as you can to your pamphlet, we'll have a little converse and then open it up to discussion.
Wonderful,
Ms.
wonderful.
Tensley.
Well, let me start by saying good evening to all of you and to thank Aspen in a special way for hosting this event on the occasion of the release of the report, which was done, I think, about a week ago at Carnegie. I'll talk about the report in a little bit, but before I get to the report and the substance of my remarks, I want to take a few moments to really thank Shankar Bajpai for all that he has done to build the US-India relationship over the span of many decades. Shankar has been one of those individuals who many of us in the United States have come time and again to for counsel. And he has been a very sage voice in helping us navigate through what have been some very difficult times. And it's wonderful that he is still very active today in US-India conversations at a time when the relationship has been truly transformed. And so he has seen it over a period of years, and I think India has been very lucky to have, of course, first the services of your father, who came to Washington and opened our mission, and then to have Shankar fill in his father's shoes. So I want to just say that, not just simply in a pro forma fashion, but because I have also been the beneficiary of his friendship over the years. So it's truly a privilege for me to be sharing this podium with him. Thank you. Thank you. I wrote this report because I was compelled by my employers to do so. Jessica Matthews pulled together a volume called Global 10, which is on the web and you can see it.
Global?
10. Global 10, T-E-N.
Not 10, okay.
And it was a volume that think tanks often do, or it's the kind of volume that think tanks often do when you have a new administration. And instead of doing a survey of all the world's issues, she decided that since the Obama administration was getting into a second term, she was going to edit this volume, which she called Global 10. And the 10 refers to the 10 subjects that the volume assesses, 5 of which are problems that the administration cannot get away from. And the other 5 are opportunities that the administration ought to seize. And needless to say, if I were to write this essay 10 years ago, probably the US-India relationship would be in the section of problems. Today it finds itself in the section on opportunities. But when I sat down to write the essay, so I've written it in 2 ways. There is a very short version, which is in the Global 10 volume. And there is the longer version, which is the monograph, which Carnegie released a week ago. When I sat down to put my mind to it, I began to be conscious of the fact that even though we have made very dramatic progress in the last 15 years or so, there are still some uncertainties that are not exactly easy to eradicate. And I didn't want to start the volume on a sort of a pessimistic note or a note that might seem indecisive. But at the back of my mind, there were some concerns that I had about what I sense as the potential for a certain slowdown in the pace of the transformation. Clearly from 2001 onwards, this relationship has galloped forward. And I sense in the last couple of years, particularly in the United States, a sort of an exhaustion with India. Part of the exhaustion is that after the civil nuclear agreement, you almost feel, or at least many Americans feel, like the boa constrictor that has just swallowed a cow. A huge chunk of food has been imbibed, and no one seems to have the energy to do anything more. And we seem to have entered a period of some sort of, enforced rest. And so that was at the back of my mind when I began to put pen to paper. And so I wanted to just flag for you what I see as the sources that contribute to these uncertainties at both ends, because it takes me to what is the central thesis of the volume, which I will elaborate in a few minutes. At the US end, I see three uncertainties that one needs to pay attention to. One is the constant temptation to lapse into something like transactionalism, where there are many constituencies in the US that feel that the US made enormous contributions to getting the civil nuclear agreement through, and now are looking to India to, in a sense, pay back those contributions. And this temptation to engage in a sort of a quid pro quo, I think, is not particularly helpful, because to my mind it runs counter to the strategic reason why this transformation in the relationship was embarked upon. The second, of course, is the perennial problem that all governments face, which is there are so many crises today that surround the United States, starting with the crises at home, which have to do with the state of the domestic economy, a very slow recovery. And of course, in the foreign policy world, the challenges posed by Iran, posed by Afghanistan and Pakistan, Syria and the Arab world, and even China, which kind of led me to confront the fact that it takes a very bold president and a very bold administration to pursue opportunities in the face of crises, because crises tend to exhaust people. And by the time one is done with managing the crisis, the opportunity gets lost. And so that was the second reality that I saw manifested in the last 4 years, and I fear that sometimes in the next 4 years may be a sort of a continuation of that trend. The third factor that left me concerned is the fact that there will be very important personnel changes in this new administration. And personnel in all governments make policy. I mean, the person is the agent of change. And so the fact that Secretary Clinton will leave, that Secretary Panetta will leave, that Deputy Secretary Carter could leave, in fact probably will leave, and people like that who were really drivers of this relationship kept me thinking about what would it take to sustain this. I see similar sorts of uncertainties at the Indian end as well. As we've seen in the last 4 years of this government, both the last 3 years, I guess, a great deal of distractions in domestic politics and a certain degree of policy inertia. It's changing, and you can certainly see that there's been a spring in the step in the last few months. But I fear that this government has not been able to respond with the kind of enthusiasm and alacrity that it showed in the first term. And that left me worried that that could lead to a certain dissipation in the gains that we had made. The second thing that I was concerned about at the Indian end is because the domestic considerations are always so overwhelming, that India would lose sight of the fact that it needed to help the US achieve a few victories in the bilateral relationship. Because the one thing that I've become very conscious about is that policy is ultimately made by very frail human beings. We call them politicians. And at the end of the day, no matter what the strategic imperatives behind doing smart things are, people need to feel that there is some personal satisfaction that they get from pursuing initiatives, which means there must be victories. And for American politicians in particular, if there are not sufficient victories, then you tend to lose interest in the issue. And it worried me that if bilaterally we cannot create circumstances which are win-win for both sides, then many important players in the American political system might simply lose their enthusiasm. So even though they admit to India's importance and India's significance for US interests, the absence of small victories might kind of produce a lack of enthusiasm. The third area, which is an area that I signaled earlier in the US case and that applies equally to India, we are going to be entering a patch, particularly in 2013, where there are going to be some very difficult regional issues that we have to confront. The first and foremost is going to be Afghanistan. And it is possible that US and Indian interests may not align perfectly. It's very obvious that this president has decided that we are going to exit Afghanistan, and that India sees that this direction to pose certain challenges for India's own security. Unfortunately, there's nothing that can be done to change that course. I mean, the president is not going to walk back that policy. And so as we manage the end game, there will be a potential for difficulties in the bilateral relationship. I see the same with Iran. We are coming very rapidly to a denouement of some sort on Iran. And this could go in many different directions. It could go in a happy direction with the Iranians and the United States reaching an agreement. That would be best. But it is equally possible, in fact, it is more likely, that we could end up in a very serious disagreement that in the worst case eventuates in military action. And of course, India has such deep interests in peace and stability in this part of the world that a conflict between the West and the United States and Iran would have very serious implications for Indian security and for the US-India relationship. And of course, Pakistan is a hardy perennial where we have disagreements. And those disagreements are not going to get any easier, because whether we like it or not, in the end game in Afghanistan, the United States will tend to use Pakistan as best it can to achieve our objectives. Now, I don't think we are in any danger of subcontracting our Afghan policy to Pakistan, but convincing Indians that that is in fact the case is an entirely different matter. And so the potential for difficulties and tension are very much there. And so against this backdrop, when I sat down to write, I said it's really important to, in a sense, go back to first principles. That is to explain first and foremost to an American audience, which often tends to forget. You know, as a young society, we don't pay too much attention to our own history, because sometimes I think we believe we don't have one, or at least one that's not long enough to have any significance. And I thought it was useful to remind ourselves of why we began the relationship with India to begin with. And the point that I make in the report is that the fundamental value of the strategic partnership really hinged on two foundations. That it was very important for the United States to help India succeed, because India's success is fundamentally in US national interests. And I cannot underestimate the importance of this proposition. And in saying so, I am not making an argument for American altruism. I'm making an argument that is deeply rooted in American self-interest. That if India succeeds in terms of achieving its developmental goals, in terms of being a successful state in the international system, that provides first a perfect validation of the success of liberal societies that are also non-Western societies, and India is a great example. But equally importantly, is vital because it contributes to a stable balance of power in Asia. And this is the point I wanted to hammer home for audiences that often tend to forget. That the reason why the United States set out, starting with Bill Clinton in the late years of his second term, and really reaching peak in the first term and the second terms of the George W. Bush administration, was because of the very strong reasoning that Indian success would contribute towards the balancing of China without the containment of China. And the subtlety of this policy is often lost in public discourse, because when we talk about strengthening India as a way of balancing China without containing it, people somehow think that this is a gigantic conspiracy that the United States is attempting to implement with respect to keeping China down. And the point that I make at some length in the monograph is that the United States cannot keep China down, because China is going to grow because of potential that is inherent in its own society. But the growth of Chinese power could have disruptive effects in Asia and could have serious consequences for US interests. And so instead of attempting to emulate what was the Cold War strategy of keeping the opponent down, the essence of American strategy in the post-Cold War period has not been to keep China down, but to raise others up. And the single most important other in this context is India. And I tried to say why India is so important. We have affinities with India for, obviously, democracy, a multinational society, a liberal society. But more significantly, India is a gigantic continental state that actually can make the balancing of China viable. It's hard to imagine a small country on China's periphery being able to balance China. But India is a different proposition. India also happens to have a fantastic benefit of location. And as anyone in real estate can tell you, it's always location, location, location. India shapes both China's terrestrial calculus and its maritime calculus, and so on and so forth. So India has a special role, and India's success is important for itself, but equally important for us. And so the point that I make in the volume at some length is that it is very important for the United States to support India's rise, even if India does not do anything to reciprocate it. Now, ideally, India ought to reciprocate it for its own reasons, because if you do find a partner like the United States so interested in helping you rise, it is in India's interest to make certain that the United States does not lose enthusiasm for that strategy. So there are compelling reasons for India to want to sustain American interest in this project. But to policymakers in Washington, I thought it was important to make the argument in the starkest possible terms. And so what I say in the manuscript is that even if India does not reciprocate, even if Indian policymakers are completely myopic, completely distracted, and completely astrategic, it is still in American interest to support that rise. Now, this is an important point, particularly because there is a temptation every now and then in the United States to think transactionally. We will support India's rise if India reciprocates in various forms. And the arguments, as you might see in the media, go from, we signed a nuclear deal, therefore you should immediately proceed to buy American reactors, or we signed a nuclear deal with you, so you should buy American aircraft, or we've signed a nuclear deal with you, so you should do X, Y, and Z. And I can understand the sentiment, but like all sentiments, one has to kind of accept them for what they are, but then take a deep breath and then judge whether one ought to act on that sentiment. And the argument, in effect, that I make is appreciate the sentiment, accept it, but don't act upon it, because it's not where it takes us in our own interest. And so the point I make in the manuscript is, think seriously about a commitment to India, not out of a sense of charity, but fundamentally because helping India get to where it wants to go serves our grand strategic interests. And that's a message I think people ought to hear. Now, there's a flip side to this. And the flip side to this is the following: that for India to get to where the United States would like to see it go, India has to make difficult choices for itself. And the most difficult choices it has to make have to do with its own domestic circumstances. And primarily, the most important choice that I see India having to make has to do with the reform of the Indian economy. Because to my mind, you don't have to be a Marxist about this, but if you do not have the material foundations of your success in place, all the other things that you want to do at the level of foreign policy, at the level of example, etc., 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 are simply not going to wash. the most effective thing that India can do for itself is to become truly a great power in a material sense, to overcome the development deficits, to be able to defeat poverty, to give its people a standard of living that rivals that of the best in the rest of the world. And if India can do that, then the Indian experiment takes on a shine, which provides it a whole series of benefits that no amount of talking about India's success will do. And so I come back to making the point that India needs to do things that will get it to where we want to see it go. And the best that the US can do is to play a supporting role. We are, in a sense, bit players. The real action is here. But the good news, to my mind, is that for the first time in many decades, the things that India needs to do for its own success also turn out very happily to be exactly the things that lead to the deepening of the US-India bilateral relationship. And I'll give you a very simple example. If India succeeds in sustaining the reform process that it has begun now 20 years ago, those reforms open the door for US participation in India's economic growth and India's success, and gives us all the material benefits that we seek from the relationship without India having to make any special efforts to keep us satisfied. And so the point I make is you don't have to do things anymore as a special favor to the United States. If India goes out to do special favors for itself, the issue of taking care of American equities automatically gets resolved. And so in the manuscript, I talk about some of the things that India should look at and some of the things that the US should look at. The one big issue that both sides can look at, of course, are India's second-generation reforms, bring those to completion. And I urge the United States to think seriously about the prospect of a free trade agreement as a way of supporting India's movement towards second-generation reforms. Now, neither of these are going to happen instantaneously. Even if they happen, they are not going to be implemented overnight. This is a long process. But I think the time has come for us to begin. And then I talk briefly about other specific things that India can do. High on my list is revisiting India's attitudes towards foreign direct investment. And I've been scratching my head to figure out what is the economic logic for constrained FDI in any sectors anymore. And I cannot come up with those. I cannot come up with any good economic reason why India should not have FDI in things like defense, atomic energy, banking, finance, you name it. I mean, pick a sector, and there is no compelling reason for why FDI should not be increased. Defense cooperation. I think we've just scratched the surface. There is much more we can do. And I lay out some ideas with respect to where we can go forward. And there's a very specific interest I have there. Unless India rethinks its attitudes to defense cooperation, the kinds of technologies that it seeks from the United States will simply not be available. And again, there's a very simple logic to this. We give the best widgets we produce to the people who work with us. I mean, it's that simple. And so if India begins to think ambitiously of working with the United States, consistent with its own interests, I mean, India doesn't have to do favors to us, but if it works with us consistent with its own interests, a whole range of cooperation becomes possible. And I talk about a couple of things that India can do with respect to Iran, but in practice, India is actually doing quite well with respect to Iran. And so my interest there is actually to sustain the present policy rather than do anything dramatic, because India has already made the biggest contribution it can make by reducing its dependence on Iranian energy and aiding the international community by sending that signal. For the US, I have three quick suggestions. The first is, which is going to be the most difficult, is to urge the highest levels of the United States government to pay attention to India. The goodwill is there. The intellectual commitment is there. But the consistent attention that is needed to nurture the relationship often is missing. And it's missing, as I said, because the president and his chief advisors are dissipated by managing crises. And so opportunities seem optional. The second issue has to do with Afghanistan. It's very important for Americans to understand how important a successful end game in Afghanistan is for sustaining the US-India relationship. And the third, of course, is defense at the American end, but defense at the American end, defense cooperation at the American end involves things like licensing reform, a more liberal attitude with respect to technology transfer, and so on and so forth. So there is a whole gamut of policy and regulatory change that we have to engage in, which we have begun. And that's the good news, that in the last few months of the Obama first term, there have been quite dramatic changes that have been made with respect to US policy in regard to defense cooperation with India. And so I urge the administration to first communicate the importance of those changes to India and now to start implementing those, because once people appreciate the extent of the change, we have tremendous opportunities ahead of us. But as I'm going to end on this note, it is less important, the details of the recommendations are in a sense less important for me. And so even though I waste a lot of ink describing those, for me what was more important in the report was to focus on the fundamentals. And I think that for me was the most satisfying part, because if we can keep the fundamentals of why we began this transformation of the relationship constantly in our focus, then I think many of the details will take care of themselves. So I'm going to end on that note, and we can. Thank you.
Ashley, as one would expect from you, you have summed it up absolutely perfectly. That is exactly what you have written, and I hope everyone will have a chance to ponder over that at leisure. But in the 20 minutes or so that are left to us, I won't take up as much time as I might have otherwise on the conversational side, because I'd like to leave maximum for question and answer. But I'd just like to elicit one or two responses from you. One thing, of course, you have pointed out, and you've put it very well in your own words, that today more than ever it is abundantly clear that strengthening US-Indian relations and sustaining India's growth in power both demand the same thing, namely that the government of India focus not so much on satisfying American entreaties as doing what is right for India itself. Now that, of course, is a question of domestic politics again, and we will leave that for the time being, but I would like to say that it's only human nature to expect some returns.
Correct.
And what you mentioned about the change of personnel is very important. I would say that whereas it was a remarkably statesman-like approach to insist that India be helped on the nuclear issue and all the other attributes of developing power, because India would then in its own interests be doing things that are helpful to America's global interest. But there was beyond that something which I don't see likely to happen again, which was this extraordinary personal commitment of President George W. Bush to Indian democracy. It's really, I can testify to this from personal experience. And his father, who was my, the president and vice president in my time, once introduced me to the young man, the former Indian ambassador, and he wouldn't let go of my hand. He just said, "You're from India? Gosh, that's a country I want to understand. How can a billion people, so poor and so uneducated, how can they keep democracy going?" That burning commitment used to come out, I was told later by Condi Rice and George Shultz, that during the campaigns, when they fed him what to talk about, he would say, "But what about India?" I don't see that kind of personal. And without that, there's bound to be some element of transactionalism. The other aspect of it is, for a long time, it used to be unpatriotic for an Indian to think well of the United States. Yes. It's no longer that bad now but the residual suspicions are there. And I can tell you, I have even met some people, even in these days,
Yes.
who say that if reforming the economy is going to help the United States, let's not reform the economy. So you have the most perverse kind of approach.
That's right.
So that is an obstacle that we have to overcome. And there are counterparts among the Ayatollahs, as we call them, of the non-proliferation regime with similar attitudes in Washington. Given that, is it possible really to look at an increase of the kind that you have mentioned without some give and take on both sides?
I think you've put your finger in many ways on what to me is the heart of the problem, that we overcame many of the challenges during the Bush period because the president was willing to make that in personal investment. Sometimes
He overrode many.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he browbeat people in his own administration to move in the direction that he wanted. Now, my own view is that that was a truly extraordinary.
Can't happen.
It will not happen again. I mean, this was that, truly extraordinary event. I mean, you won't duplicate that. But I don't infer from that, therefore, that we cannot succeed, and I'll tell you why. And it goes to something you said. President Obama, at the cerebral level, understands clearly the importance of India. And I unfortunately can't say more than I'm going to say in the next minute, but in the instructions that he has left for his administration, the clarity with which he has expressed the importance of India for American purposes is second to none. Now the question then becomes, will he take the time to press his government to implement his vision? My own instinct is that he is going to find it a lot more difficult because the environment has become difficult for him personally in terms of US domestic politics, the challenges that the US economy faces today, which George W. Bush did not have to deal with for most of the 8 years he was in office. So what is the solution? The solution, to my mind, consists of creating wins for the president. Because, as you point out, at the end of the day, they need something to motivate them. They understand at the level of strategy India's importance. But if in practical terms, he cannot come away with the sense that India has the payoffs, to use the terms an economist would use, that the payoffs are positive, the incentives to kind of make the effort begin to diminish. And so I think you compensate for the absence of GWBs, personal commitment, by creating outcomes that provide incentives for people like President Obama and his successors, because 4 years from now you will have a different president who may have the same vision of India's importance but may not be as committed. And so how does one stimulate that commitment? The only answer is the wins. And then we come back to the question of, then does India have to produce wins as a favor to American presidents? And the answer is no.
We do it for our own sake, but the fact remains that you do need to keep the other side feeling that you're doing something which is good. But here I come to a basic difference between the past and today. The days when we were not getting on very well with each other was when the overriding fact of international life was the contest between you and the Soviet Union, where we were seen as inimical to America's interests. Now, if the overriding fact of today's world is the rise of China, we are not seen as even inimical. So that's a tremendous advantage. In those days, every other quarrel that we had, whether it was colonialism or about Diego Garcia or anything, were all seen by Washington in terms of the effect on the Soviet. That is no longer true. Nevertheless, take an issue like Iran, which you have made almost a touchstone of what might happen. I fully understand the depth of American feelings, right or wrong, we will leave alone. But they're there, so we need to take that into consideration. But given the fact that it is not related to this overriding fact of life, how damaging would it be if we differ really profoundly as we would if you attack the Iranians?
I think I'll give you an example of why I'm hopeful. Of course, if we come out with a peaceful solution for Iran, we're all off the hook. But I'll take you back to a period that you will remember very vividly, which was 2001 to 2003, because of Bob. India had very deep reservations about what the Bush administration was about to do in Iraq. And we navigated that disagreement with stunning success. And there was a very simple rule that both of us followed in managing that disagreement. We were not going to go public. We were not going to make extraordinary efforts to embarrass our friends with whom we had disagreements with. And I can tell you, because I was the note taker in many of the meetings between American principals and the Indian counterparts. And in private, Indian leaders did not hold back in telling us their concerns about both what they feared was our stupidity and informing us about their worries about the consequences of what we were going to leave behind for India's interests. In private, there was absolutely no reservation about expressing that. But the government of the day was extraordinarily careful in how this was expressed publicly. And so if it comes to a crisis, I just hope we can find some way of mimicking that performance. Because to my mind, if we get to the point where we are engaged in a serious conflict with Iran, and India makes its opposition extremely vocal, and does not, in a sense, convey the fact that we tried for many years to get a peaceful solution. In fact, this president wants to get a peaceful solution. Then I think it would put the relationship in a very difficult position. And particularly,
I think it's only fair to warn you
yes,
that politics has changed enormously.
I appreciate
Today's political situation may compel us to, in fact, agree with you in private, but denounce you vociferously in public. Anyway, I've had enough.
That's a very useful caution.
Ladies and gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Very useful caution.
Could we start with, yes, please.
Thank you very much. That was a very, very interesting overview. My question basically pertains to one very specific area. You did allude to the India's position in the Indian Ocean affecting China's maritime security calculus, and also the fact that China has on many occasions said that the Indian Ocean is not India's ocean. And now I relate it to President Obama's tilt or pivot to the Asia Pacific. Well, now the Asia Pacific is no longer really the Asia Pacific, it's more about the Indo-Pacific. And if this pivot happens towards the Asia Pacific specifically, and with sequestration happening and all our defense budgets under a lot of strain, there is going to be a certain amount of slack which is going to occur in the Indian Ocean, which he himself has said is the most dangerous place on earth. So would India be expected to take up the slack? And is India geared up to take up such a slack, notwithstanding our claims to being a regional power? Do we have that kind of sea power capability to be able to take up the slack the way the US would like us to? That's my question.
I think the accurate answer to that is that the US desires India to contribute towards taking up the slack. There is a very clear and a very transparent message that both Secretary Panetta and Secretary Clinton have conveyed in writing and in their speeches. And that is, we would like to see India be present in a very serious and significant way, not only in the Indian Ocean, but even east of the Indian Ocean. Because I agree with you completely. We see the two as integrated spaces. Whether India has the capacity is something that India needs to reflect upon. And that is partly a function of what is it that India will actually do. There are many things that India can do in my view. And one of the most obvious things that India and the United States can cooperate on is with respect to maritime domain awareness, which is the first fundamental before you do anything in the maritime space, right? You need to know what is happening before you attempt to manage the outcomes. I see the biggest challenge here is not India's capacity, because India has the technical capacity and the material capacity. I see the biggest challenge here as the reservations that Indian policymakers have about working with the United States for fear that any cooperation might signal a diminution in strategic autonomy. Now, I find this somewhat bewildering, because to my mind, if India chooses to cooperate with the United States in this, it is the exercise of strategic autonomy. I mean, it is India that chooses to do so. And India will do so only if it sees it to be in its interest. I think it is in India's interest. And if we can find a regime by which we can share information, particularly in the northern Indian Ocean, which is critical because of the energy traffic and material merchandise traffic and so on and so forth, I see this as an immediate win-win for both countries. And this is one case where I said India has the material capacity, it just has to make the political decision.
Related to that, if I may.
One second, please.
May I just add?
No, I'm afraid not. There's not enough time. One question per head. Governor Jha.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I was very gratified to hear from our distinguished speaker that the urge on the part of the United States to ensure that India succeeds will always be there, because it sees India as a counterbalancing force or a stabilizing force in Asia, particularly with the rise of China. But Mr. Tellis, the big concern at the moment here is your withdrawal from Afghanistan, which we understand is inevitable, and the domestic concerns and pressures, and no president can oppose it. But in the manner in which we get the impression that Pakistan is going to be given a very important role in deciding the future setup in Afghanistan. And not only that, for example, the former militants, who may or may not be former, I mean, they will just pretend to be former militants, are going to be in charge of, given the administration or the governorship of Kandahar and the areas around Jalalabad, which means Pakistan automatically gets a depth there. So this is apart from the fact that the entire jihadi movement could then turn towards India. And this is the concern here. Now, under the circumstances, I think the best thing that America can do is reinforce the understanding. I won't call it alliance, because, as you rightly said, Ambassador Bajpai also has, that the word alliance somehow would not be a popular word in India for some time to come, to strengthen our capabilities in the economic and military sphere. And this, I think, has to be done, doesn't matter which president is there or whatever the change of personnel in the administration would be. Thank you very much.
I concur completely.
We agree, sir. Let's go to the next. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Tellis, you talked about FDI and opening up, and why should there not be? 3 days ago, during the Vibrant Gujarat, the Japanese ex-ambassador was making this distinction between FDI from the US and Europe and FDI from Japan and perhaps Korea, that they are more interested in manufacturing, which gives jobs, and the US and Europe are more interested in technologies, which takes the money away but does not give jobs. Do you think there is a distinction to be made there?
I mean, I don't think that is an economically sensible distinction. I mean, I can understand the political economy arguments that lead to such distinctions, but when one thinks of the economics of it, ultimately, what does FDI mean? FDI is simply providing capital for any endeavor that the donor, as it were, wants to pursue. And ultimately, it's a question of, if you are capital starved, as I believe India is relative to its needs, right, then the only question is whether the investments that take place take place in a manner consistent with your objectives. As long as those objectives are clear, and we all know that India requires enormous amounts of capital, for example, in infrastructure development, in agriculture, you name it. I mean, there's not a single sector where India could not do with investment. The source of that investment becomes really irrelevant. All you want is the capital. You want to make certain that the manifestations, the physical manifestations of this capital take place in accordance with certain rules that are transparent and clear. And once those rules are transparent and clear and enforced, I don't see what the difficulty is. So when people tell me, for example, that, oh, atomic energy is this highly sensitive area, I am completely confused. Because what does it actually mean when you say we have FDI in atomic energy? It means that country X can now provide financial capital to build a reactor that will be operated in India, ultimately producing and selling electricity that will be purchased by various Indian consumers. To my mind, the way I think about it is that it has already saved the Indian state from having to cough up a few $1 billion to build its own reactors. So if somebody else does it, it just adds, in a sense, to the pool of capital that you can then use for other users. So as long as there's a regulatory system that defines clearly what the investments are to be used for, essentially you want to prevent misuse, right? Where you invest should be open sesame. Same in defense. I mean, if you say, you know, we're going to have a foreign country build a shipbuilding plant, I mean, what is the strategic logic for not preventing that? It allows you to free up your dollars, your yen, you know, your resources to do other things. Ultimately, the fact that somebody builds a plant that produces ships or builds ships, and the fact that it comes with foreign investment, ipso facto does not pose a threat to the country. And so I understand the politics of the distinction, but the economics of the distinction are meaningless.
Yes, but I have 5 questions in 5 minutes, so please, I will have to be brief. No, I'll take it.
Thank you, sir. I am inventor. The biggest problem is that, in India, we are not protecting our intellectual property. So we are, our Indian filing grants of patents, has reduced by 75% in last 5 years. So, there is some, you can say people, dubious people, who are filing bogus patents, and they are, creating all the problems. Unless, we have patents, no country in the world is going to, give us latest technology.
I'm sure
that
you're
is
right.
our real problem.
I'm sure you're right, but how does it promote Indo-American relations?
Sir, actually, this is very essential, because without, our
That's something for us to do.
Yes.
Yes, sir, fine. Thank you. Yes, sir. I've got you.
You have very admirably talked about how important it is for the US that India is a success story. In this background, why is it that the US does not support India's membership of the Security Council?
Oh, I think that issue has been discussed and settled. The President of the United States has committed formally that when the Security Council gets expanded, the United States will support India's membership as a permanent member. That has been settled.
May I please add here that this is one of the misconceived ambitions of the Indian intellectual elite. Why do we waste our time and energy on making this the touchstone of foreign friendship? First of all, whenever we're on the Security Council, we don't know what to say on half the issues. Secondly, when you're a permanent member, you are forced to take positions, which is something we prefer not to. Third, and most important of all, the Security Council cannot be reformed in isolation. It has to be part of the complete reform of the United Nations system. That's not going to happen. There can be no expansion without the decisions regarding Japan, regarding Germany, possibly Italy, Brazil. These are not going to happen. So why do we consider this as somehow a touchstone of friendship towards India? To me, it's a waste of time and energy. Please forgive me, but I have to be blunt. Krishna.
Thank
sorry.
you.
Actually, for someone like me who lived through the pain in America of US-India relations in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. I think the relationship has undergone a sea change for the better. Americans are impatient deal makers. You have an Indian gene in you. I think you should teach them patience about this.
Are Indians patient? When did we become patient?
Hopefully,
Where can India go? We have to manage our relationship with China also. Till the other day, your president was telling the Chinese authorities to manage South Asia. Till the other day, your generals were telling the world and telling your authorities that India's harmless development activity in Afghanistan was dangerous. There are suspicions which we have to live down on both sides.
of course.
I think we are both doing it, so I really do not share your concerns. I am optimistic about this relationship, but it needs time to mature and develop.
Hallelujah.
Don't push us, don't rush us.
I agree.
Thank you. Run here.
Well, I've heard that the Obama administration wants to curb the outsourcing to India, so that would affect our relations, and that is purely a domestic issue, I think.
It's a claim that is often made in the run-up to the election. It's a claim that is forgotten immediately after people get elected. Everyone understands some very simple rules of economics. Outsourcing increases the competitiveness of American firms. Yes, it does contribute in some instances to a loss of jobs. Those are the adjustment effects of trade, generally. But what it does is, if it ends up increasing welfare writ large, because now the firm is more competitive, it can put its resources into higher revenue and higher profit yielding endeavors, then essentially the country as a whole comes out ahead. I mean, this is elementary international economics 101. Everyone understands it. In the run-up to elections, it is convenient to forget it because you're looking for votes from communities that are sometimes affected by the adjustment cost of trade. But I don't see any executive in the United States basically saying that we are going to pursue an anti-outsourcing agenda as a serious policy option. Now, the Congress is a different matter because Congress is very focused on reaching out and managing constituency issues. But if you are the executive branch and you have to think of the United States in its totality, that is not simply constituents but also American corporations, American business, et cetera, then when you do the net assessment, as it were, you simply discover that, foreign trade leaves us more prosperous than we would be in its absence. And part of the consequences of having foreign trade is going to be outsourcing. And in some circumstances, a transient loss of jobs. The challenge to my mind in dealing with outsourcing is not to curb outsourcing, but to actually use the efficiency gains that you get from trade to move towards higher value added products so that you begin to dominate the sunrise sectors of the global economy while recognizing that you are going to suffer loss in the sunset sectors. And so if at the end of the day I'm losing jobs which are essentially clerical jobs, right, which is what a lot of business process outsourcing is, and I get those resources and I can use it to R&D, I put it into R&D for high-end development, I would trade the loss of what are essentially low value-added jobs for higher value-added endeavors any day. And if the United States is serious about maintaining its domination of the global economic system, then I do not see any alternative to adopting this approach, which is you trade some sectors, it provides opportunities for other states, to follow in your wake, and you take the resources that you get from the loss of those sectors, move them into other sectors where you have no competitors.
One last question for the lady here.
Great outline of the challenges facing both countries. But I'm wondering if I could push you a little bit more on the issue of Afghanistan. Given what you Afghanistan, given what you outlined as the need for victories on issues on facing both countries, as well as similar interests, really. We both, certainly it's in India's interest as well as the US's interest to have a stable Afghanistan, prevent a return of the previous regime. Why would that, given that these two can converge with regard to Afghanistan, do you not see that leading to closer cooperation? For a while it seemed like there was much happening on that front, and now there's been a bit stepping back. So I was just wondering if your thoughts on that. Thanks.
I see where you're coming from, Rani, but the problem is there are multiple pieces in play. And there are some elements where there is the potential for some sort of tension, but there are other elements where there is a very strong convergence. I'll give you an example of each. Where we come into the greatest tension has to do with the whole policy of reconciliation and the implications of reconciliation for the Afghanistan we're going to leave behind. And the issues of tension arise in two directions. One, the necessity for Pakistan to play a constructive role in getting a successful reconciliation, which then leads to Indian fears that we are subcontracting our Afghan policy to Pakistan. And then two, that what is the definition of successful reconciliation? Is it simply a solution that provides a decent interval for the United States to exit? Or is it genuinely a post-American solution that leads to stability rather than making things worse? We need to have a conversation because in principle our objectives are the same. But there is a genuine fear in India, and I can understand it, that in the rush to leave, we may end up settling for expedient solutions rather than sensible ones. I can understand this fear completely. The consensus of all the Afghan people. So you cannot have political change that is just settled between Karzai and his successor and some outside power. So there are many elements where the components of convergence are very strong. But this is something that's going to take a lot of work because of the number of moving parts. And where there is convergence, I think the problems are problems of coordination. We just have to make certain that the US and India are operating in a sense on a script that is synchronized. Where there are problems potentially of tension is where reassurance is going to be required. And it also, I mean, there is an obligation that is imposed on the United States to be responsible. Now, my own view is that thus far, the President of the United States has been quite responsible with respect to Afghanistan. I have personal disagreements with the policy, so I'm not going to get into an extended discussion on that issue. But I have to give him credit where credit is due, that he has, at least thus far, attempted to do things in an orderly fashion. And I will take this opportunity just to address one question that was raised earlier, and that is the whole High Peace Council paper that has reached the internet, and which many people in India believe is somehow the secret American plan for reconciliation. Let me just say this very clearly. The High Peace Council's approach to reconciliation is not American policy. In fact, as it stands, the solution that is proposed is something that would undermine American interests. And so it is not a policy that the United States will pursue or support. So I think Indians need to appreciate that the fact that we have not come out and condemned the paper has to do for reasons that have to do with intra-alliance management, not anything to do with the equities on the issue.
Ladies and gentlemen, I must tell you that all my life I have believed, working life, that Indo-American cooperative relationships are good for both countries and for the world, which does not mean that we will not have very, very bitter even differences. I don't think we should talk of friendship when it comes to international relations. Countries are not friends. They can be enemies. But people are friends and not countries. So we will have only the commonalities of interests and objectives as far as governments are concerned, but the relationships between the peoples can inform that relationship and is doing so. But I have to say that it will always be a matter of gratification to me that ultimately we are at a stage where, as has been repeatedly said, the strength of India is seen as an asset to the United States. I'm not sure that some of the countries that many Indians ask us to look upon as an alternative ally or friend, we cannot say the same that they wish us as well as the United States wish us. So let us think on that when we think about India's interests. Meanwhile, let us thank our lucky stars that we have so devoted, so able, and so wise a friend as Ashley
Thank you.
in Washington.
Thank you, Shankar. Thank you. Thank you very much.
But if you are not going to protect the intellectual property,